making their way in, so we'll go ahead and get started. I got quite a bit of content to go over, and hopefully maybe time for questions at the end. If not, please find me, tweet me, do something, and let's talk. And I'd love to hear your questions. I don't know about you, but just listening to the talks today and the workshop, being at the workshop yesterday, it seems like it's a very exciting time right now to be a web developer, and even just seeing the specifications and standards that are coming out, it seems that it's like a very unique time for the web. And when talking about web components, and when I first started using web components, it was really, I don't know, but I figured it would compare to what it felt like to use HTML when it first came out. These people must have been so amazed, oh man, I could use these simple elements to build this document and then share it on the internet. That's amazing. And so I hope that excitement comes out in this talk, and I hope that you're excited for the direction that the web is going. My name is Matt Shull, and I'm a web producer at Aristotle, and I work out of Little Rock, Arkansas. And in my spare time, I like to mentor students at thinkful.com, and so I mentor AngularJS and front-end development students. And on Twitter, I'm usually talking about web components or geeking out about web performance, and if you want to geek out with me, feel free. And you can also check out mattshull.com for anything else that I've done. So I have articles up there about web performance and other things. So if you want to follow along, I've got the slides and all the references and resources that we're going to talk about at mattshull.com/webcomponents. So feel free to check that out. So we're going to look at today what web components are. We're going to look at how to create web components. And then we're going to take a look at Polymer and understand why using Polymer helps us to create web components even easier. But before we get into all that, I wanted to just kind of get a feel for the room and see how many of you have heard about web components before coming to Future Insights Live. Okay, so quite a number of you. All right, now keep your hand raised if you're using web components in production on a live site. No one. And that's kind of the big question, right? Like the big question among people is, are they production ready? And so after we talk about how to create them, we're going to then look at some web components in production, and then talk about a few things to consider before using them in production in your own projects. So web components are custom elements that have superpowers, so you can actually define these custom elements, what functionality or what style that they have. They use the basic building blocks of the web, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so we don't actually need a framework to create web components, and that's one of the big sells for web components. But web components are framework compatible, so you can use those custom elements with jQuery or style them with CSS. They're reusable and shareable, so you can reuse them multiple times in your document. And it's really easy to share web components because it's just as easy as sharing an HTML file, someone putting it in their own project, and then just using that custom element that you've built. And I was getting some feedback at work on this talk, and I was talking to a coworker, and she compared web components to calculus. And I was like, okay, I don't really know where you're going with this. But she said she walked into the calculus class, sat down, professor comes in and writes out this long algebraic equation, and the professor says, just forget about all that. And instead, she erased everything and wrote out this really short calculus equation, and she was like, this is how we're going to find the same answer. And immediately, my coworker said she fell in love with calculus. And that's actually a really good analogy because it's kind of a tale as old as time. You start a project and you want to include an image slider in the project. Instead of reinventing the wheel, you go to some framework like maybe Bootstrap and you see code that looks like this. So you can see we have a lot of HTML markup here. We have a lot of data attributes, a lot of classes, and if you look very, very closely, you can actually see the actual content of the image slider, which is the images. So what if instead of using this, we were to use something like this? So we have a custom element called image slider, and inside of that, we just put in our images. And that's the code that's being rendered here on the right side of the screen, and you can see that it works just like an image slider would. So this is a lot easier in terms of syntax. If someone were to come into your company or come into your agency as a new developer and they were to open up a document and see that, they would immediately know what purpose that element had. And they would immediately know, okay, those images are the images for that image slider. And it makes sense that we would move in this direction for development. So iOS and Android developers have had libraries for many years now that they can quickly build complex applications. And so this is allowing us to do the same. So we can create standard styles or standard functionality that we use in our company or just as a freelancer and use it across multiple projects. So web components are made up of 4 different specifications. Each one is pretty impressive in its own right, but with their powers combined, they create the Captain Planet of web development, which are web components. And if you don't get that joke, that's okay. My wife didn't either. I actually had to explain who Captain Planet was to my wife. And then we had to like get the YouTube video for the theme song, and then I started singing it, and she goes, "Oh, that's funny." And I just lost all meaning then. But there's templates, custom elements, shadow DOM, and HTML imports. And the first one we're going to look at is templates. So templates allow us to have inactive markup in our document. And the only way to make that active is to stamp it out using a script. So all the media files inside of a template, any images, any videos, they're not going to be downloaded until that template is made active using a script. So for web components, we have a template element, and inside of that template element, we're going to have a style block with some HTML markup. So for each of the specifications, we're going to work with an example of an image slider. You can see it rendered out here. It's just like we looked at just a moment ago. And we're going to look at a couple of documents. The first document is an index file. So we've got our index here, and you can see in the body element we have our image slider with our 4 images. Then we have an image slider.html file, and this is the file that's creating the web component. So it's defining the functionality for our custom element in this file. And in the file you see we open up the HTML tag, and then we have our template element, and we give it an ID of image slider, which is important, we'll come back to in a moment. And then we have our style block and some HTML markup, and I've minimized those for now. They're actually there, but they're just minimized because we're not so much worried about the image slider as we are the specification. So under there we have the script block, and in there you see we have a bunch of JavaScript, which we'll take a look at in a moment, but this is actually, every time our custom element is being called, this is what's setting that functionality. The next specification is custom elements, so that's what allows us to take that big block of markup there and convert it into this simple HTML element of image slider. So if you look in the bottom of our script, we have a register element method, and it actually has 2 arguments. The first is the name of our custom element, so we have image slider. And it's important to note that there's a dash there, and the dash is actually required by the custom element specification because it allows the browser to know that that's a custom element and not a native HTML element. And this is for forward thinking. As HTML creates new elements and puts it in HTML, the dashes will allow that browser to know, okay, this is a custom element built by the developer. The second argument is an object that's setting a prototype property to a variable called image slider prototype. And if we look at that variable, we can see that we have an object create method, and it's creating an HTML element prototype. And then that prototype has a created callback function, and that's what's defining what template to use and setting up the shadow DOM, which we'll take a look at in a moment. There's also one other specification for custom elements, and that's the ability to actually extend native HTML elements. So we can take an HTML element and actually extend that functionality or extend the styling. And there's a few differences, and to take a look at these differences, we're going to change our example to an example of these buttons. So we have buttons here that are called cool buttons, because I couldn't think of anything else creative. And you can see that it has some styling about it, and this is just CSS. And if we take a look, we can see that in the body we have a button element with an is attribute set to cool button. So instead of using a HTML custom element, we simply set the is attribute to whatever the custom element is called. And if we take a look at the web component file, we see we have a template with an ID of cool button. Then we have a style block, and again, the style block is minimized, but all the CSS is there. And then we have a content element as our markup. We're going to take a look at that in a moment, but that is all the markup that's needed for creating these cool buttons. And there's a couple of more differences. You'll notice that in the register element method, we have, in the second argument in our object, we have an extends property set to button, and this is what tells the web component that it's extending the native button element. And then in our cool button prototype variable, when we use object create, we want to use the HTML button element prototype instead of the HTML element prototype. Again, this is telling it that we want to use the button element. The next specification is the shadow DOM. This is probably one of the most powerful specifications in web components. It allows for DOM encapsulation, which solves what I endearingly call the Stack Overflow dilemma. So if you've ever gone at Stack Overflow and you find someone else's, let's say, CSS, and you really like the way that they set up their CSS, so you copy and paste it into your own project and then bring up your page, and all of a sudden your entire CSS is messed up. It's because the naming conventions were similar and they're competing CSS rules there. So we can actually prevent this with shadow DOM. So let's take a look. We're going to go back to our image slider example here, and you can see that we have an H1 element that says that is set to image slider, and then it actually has black font. But if you look in the index.html file, we have a style block in the head block, and it has a rule for all the H1 elements to have a font color of red. But again, our color is black, and that's because the H1 element is actually inside of our web component. So we're back at the web component file. If we look in the template, you can see in the markup we have an H1 element set to image slider. So none of the styles set in the index.html file are leaking into our web component, and likewise, none of the styles or any of the markup that's inside of our web component are going to leak out into other web components or any other DOM. And there's a lot more that goes into this. This is a basic overview of it. So I've got the links to the shadow DOM and some other articles that you should definitely check out. So the shadow DOM specification also allows for the content element. And if we take a look at our web component file for our image slider, you see we have a content element, and it has a select attribute, and it's set to image. So what the shadow DOM does is whenever our custom element is rendered, it's going to overshadow any of the DOM that's inside of that custom element with this template. So again, we're defining what the template of our element should be, and it's going to replace what's inside of our custom element with that template. So the question is, how do we get those images inside our custom element inside of our template? And the content element is the answer. So again, we're wanting to select all the images inside of our custom element and place them here inside of the template. So let's take a look at the code on how to create a shadow DOM. If we look back in our web component file and we look inside of the created callback function, we can see there's a variable with create shadow root function, and that's creating the shadow DOM. And then we have a variable of template that's querying the selector, so it's looking for the image slider template, or the template with an image slider ID. And then we're appending, we're using shadow append child to clone the template, because we don't want to use the same template. Again, every time we call that custom element, we want it to make a clone of that template. So that way we can use it multiple times in our document. So it's placing that template inside the shadow DOM so that every time it's called, it's going to use that template. The last specification we'll take a look at is HTML imports. This is a rather simple specification, but you can see it allows us to import the web component file into our document so that we can use that custom element in our document. And we have to actually import the web component file before the document renders our custom element. So if we take a look at index.html, you can see we're importing that web component. There's one last thing about HTML imports, and if we look at our web component file, you can see we have a variable set to import doc, and it's set to document current script, owner script. And this allows us to refer that variable to the web component file. If we were to just use document, it would be referring to the index.html file. So when we're setting our template, we're using import.querySelector, and that's querying all of the selectors of ID image slider inside of our web component file, not inside of our index.html file. So we've taken a look at the web component specifications, and now we're going to look at a service that actually allows us to create web components even easier. And there are three that are quite popular today. There's Polymer, Xtag, and Bosonic. But today we are talking about Polymer. And Polymer is developed by the fine folks at Google. And as of this past Thursday, they released Polymer 1.0. So over the weekend I had a lot of fun tweaking the slides and tweaking all of my examples so that it would be current, because you can't roll up into Future Insights Live with the previous version. But Polymer actually isn't a framework. Again, we want to move away from a framework, and Polymer is actually a web component that makes web components. So again, we're still using the basic building blocks of the web. And it allows us to use easier syntax to give our web components superpowers. So we can actually create custom attributes for our custom element, which we'll take a look at in a moment. We can give our web component one-way and two-way data binding powers, and we can also do event behaviors like tap, click. We can even set up our own custom event behaviors. So we're going to take a look at the difference between a vanilla JavaScript web component and a Polymer web component. And again, we're going to go back to our image slider example. You can see here's the vanilla JavaScript version, and here's the Polymer version. So you can see there's a key difference there, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But it works just the same. So let's take a look at our index.html file for our Polymer web component. You can see there's a few differences here. The first is that we are importing a script called webcomponents.js. This is a polyfill that allows us to fill in the gaps for browsers that don't support the templates, custom elements, HTML imports, and shadow DOM. We're going to take a look at browser support in a minute, but just know that that's the polyfill. Then we import our polymer.html file, which is our Polymer web component that allows us to create web components. And then we import polymer slider.html, which is our image slider element. So if we take a look at the rendering, you can see that our H1 element has a font color of red. And that's because the shadow DOM specification for Polymer actually isn't using shadow DOM. And the reason for this is because the shadow DOM polyfill was quite heavy, so they created what they called the shady DOM. And the biggest difference in this, if we look in the source, is that instead of creating a shadow DOM and putting that template inside of the shadow DOM, it's going to replace what's inside of our custom element with the actual template. So because of that, our H1 CSS rule is being set for that DOM that's being imported. So in order to get around this, we use on our style block, we have an is attribute set to custom-style. And if we save that, you'll see that we have the same type behavior as with the vanilla JavaScript web component. So in the body element, you can see we have our custom element with our 4 images, no change there. So let's take a look at the web component file. You can see that it's much simpler than the vanilla JavaScript web component. So we have a DOM module element, which is allowing us to create the web component, and it's set to an ID of image-slider, and that has to be the name of the custom element that you want to create. And then we have our template with our style block and our HTML markup. That's not changed. And then the script has drastically changed. You can see that we're simply using the Polymer function, and we're setting a property of is to image slider, and again, that's the name of our custom element. And that's all that's needed to create our image slider web component. So let's take a look at some examples. Again, we're going to go back to our cool button element, and this time we're going to take a look at how to extend the native HTML elements using Polymer. So we have in the index.html file, we have our polyfill, we have our Polymer web component and our cool button web component. And then in the body, we have the button element with an is attribute set to cool button. And if we look at the web component file, you can see that we have our DOM module element set to cool button with an ID of cool button. We have our styles and our template with the content element for the markup. And then inside of the Polymer function, we have the is property set to cool button, and then we have an extends property set to button. And that's how we extend native HTML elements using Polymer. So again, we can look at the vanilla JavaScript version and then look at our Polymer version. So I use lorempixel.com. Anybody else use Lorem Pixel for placeholder images? I use it quite a bit, and so I decided I was going to set out to create a Lorem Pixel HTML element. So we're going to look at how to add custom attributes. We're going to look at computed properties and data binding in our web component. But the hope and the goal is to retrieve a placeholder image. So if we look at the index.html file for Lorem Pixel, I've minimized the head block, but again, we have our polyfill, our Polymer web component, and our Lorem Pixel web component. And inside of the body, we see we have two Lorem Pixel elements. We have one that has a number of attributes on it, and then one that just simply has the custom element. If we look inside the web component, we can see that we have the DOM module with an ID set to Lorem Pixel. Then we have a template. We actually don't have any styles with this, but we have a template with an image, and the source is using data binding to compute with a function of compute source. In our script, we have the is property set to Lorem Pixel, and then we have a properties property, and in there we're defining all the custom attributes that can go with this custom element. So we're giving it what type of attribute it's going to be, and then also the value or the default value for each of these attributes. And then we have a compute source that's running a function, and it's getting the image source that we want to use, and then again, it's data binding that to the source in our template. So if we take a look at that, we can even take a look at this. We see we have our Lorem Pixel element. Oops, there we go. So let's take a look at another example. We have a Google YouTube element. So Google over the past year has done a great job, along with the Polymer team, to set up custom elements for all different types of services that they provide. So whether it's Google YouTube or Google Sign-In, there's an HTML element you put on the page, and it lets you sign in using Google. And then there's Google Charts. There's hundreds of whatever API they have, you can bet that they have a web component for it. So this is more of an example of a complex web component working with a complex API, and we're simply retrieving a YouTube video. You can see we have the Charlie Bit Me video playing there. And we're not going to look at the web component file. It's quite large and would be here for a little bit. But we will take a look at the index. You can see all I'm doing is using the Google YouTube element and setting the video ID attribute to the video ID, and it rendered the video. So you can see that this really allows us to have a lot easier syntax in creating web components and custom elements, allowing us to set that basic functionality that we want. So if you're using image sliders a lot, you can create that for your company or for yourself as you develop. But the Polymer team has actually done a great job of providing some basic custom elements and basic web components that they give away for free. So there are different types. We're going to take a kind of a detailed look at two of them, and we're going to do an overview about the rest of them. But the first one is the iron elements, and these are visual or non-visual elements that have some basic functionality. So like with layout or user input or even scaffolding, this allows us to kind of have those basic web components. And one of the examples is Iron Ajax. So you can actually make an Ajax request using an HTML element, and then you can data bind the data that's sent back to another web component and manipulate it however you want inside of that web component to show to the user. Then there are Polymer paper elements, and these are really cool elements. These are highly visual elements that incorporate material design. So material design is a specification that Google's been working on for the past couple of years. And as of this Thursday, they released a ton more examples of material design. We can take a look at a couple of them here. We have an input, and this is a basic paper input element with an attribute of floating label. It also allows us to do character counts or auto validation. There's just a number of things you can do from this one simple web component. There are a few other, and majority of these were released this past Thursday, so I haven't had a chance to work with a number of them, but the Google services we talked about, so Google Sign-In, Google Charts, and Google YouTube. There's also gold elements, which are e-commerce elements, so they're trying to set this basic style or this basic functionality of the checkout flow. There are neon elements, which would deal with animation and special effects, and then platinum elements, which deal with offline use, push notifications, and then molecules that you can use as wrappers for third-party libraries. So we asked the question at the beginning, are web components production ready? So I would say yes, absolutely. And so would Polymer. As of this last Thursday, that's been their big quote, is that as of 1.0, Polymer is production ready. And even at Aristotle, we haven't started using them on client websites, so we do a lot of state tourism or city tourism websites, and we haven't started using them there, but what we've done to get our developers and designers acclimated to web components is start using them for internal tools. So recently I built a web performance tool that we used with web components. So it's been very successful. Our developers have actually really loved it, and even our designers have really loved it, again, because now most of our designers know HTML and CSS, and so now they can actually create these complex kind of applications and with just HTML elements. But we're going to look at some other web components in production. The first is GitHub. So if you've ever gone to GitHub, you've seen that it'll tell you when this file or folder was updated. And if you actually look at the source, you can see that it's a time element, which isn't a custom element, but it has an is attribute of time ago. So GitHub has extended the functionality of this time element to include some different functionality, and I believe it's about updating when that was. So it'll update that time as you sit there on the page. Then the Polymer project website, so again, 1.0 production ready. If you take a look at if you look in their code, take a look at the top navigation, you'll see actually a number of custom elements being used to create this website. So we have scroll area, site banner, paper or app bar, core icon, and drop-down panel are all different custom elements, and that's just the navigation. And then the Google I/O website was actually created using Web Components and Polymer. And this was actually really cool to look at because they had the Google sign-in, which we talked about earlier, but they had all these custom elements that allow you to create your own schedule, to change the time zone of that schedule. It would remind you of when the next session was coming up, and it would do push notifications and even offline use. It was really cool to dig around in there, and Google and the Polymer team have uploaded all of those web components to GitHub, so you can take a look at those and have links at the website, mattshull.com/webcomponents, if you want to check that out. And these slides. So whenever I was looking at creating slides, I actually wanted to find someone else's web component and use it to create slides. So I did a little Google search, and it actually didn't take long. I found someone that created a web component called Ninja Presentation. So here you can see in my dirty HTML that's marked up all over the place, we have Ninja Presentation, and then we have a web component called Ninja Slide, and there's custom attributes with that. So it literally took a few seconds. I downloaded his web component, put it in my project, and then started using those custom elements that they provided. and there was great documentation for them as well. And that's another thing that the Polymer team has actually done really well on, is giving you great documentation on how to use the web components that they created, and even build your own. They have different tutorials that you can check out where you can actually work with this starter kit that they call it, to build an application quickly. So there's some things to consider whenever looking at using Web Components and Polymer in production. And the first is browser compatibility, which is what everybody wants to know about. So Chrome is actually, Chrome and Opera are the only two that actually support all the specifications natively. Firefox is on the way. Hopefully that'll be soon. Safari only supports templates, which is sad. But then Internet Explorer actually doesn't support any of them, which is even sadder. But you can actually go to the IE website and vote on these specifications and let them know. I was talking about it being a very unique time for web developers. It's great because now browser makers are actually listening to us as developers. And so I want to encourage you, I've got the links on my website, go take a look, vote for these specifications, because it is important to let them know what it is that you want to see. With polyfill support, you can see that IE 11 and up and everything else are supported. And for custom elements and HTML imports, IE 10 is a little flaky. So, but all the evergreen browsers are supported, and even the mobile browsers. Performance is another thing, again, that I geek out about. And as of this past Thursday, there is the Polymer web component and all of the polyfills are 19 to 42 gigabytes gzip. So that's incredible, actually. And you can actually play around with, if you want to use a minified version of the polyfill. So if you're using browsers that actually support it, you don't have to use that Shadow DOM polyfill if you don't want to. And you can take a look at that. It's actually, Polymer is 3 times faster since the 0.5, which is their last stable version. And then also, there's a lot of overhead when you're importing all of these HTML files into the head block. So one of the things that the Polymer team did was create a tool called Vulcanize, where you can bring all those web components into one file within Grunt or Gulp. And the last thing to consider, and probably the most important thing, is accessibility. So let's take an example. Let's say our cool button element. If we were to create a custom element button without extending that native button element, none of the accessibility for buttons is actually included in that custom element. So when we're creating custom elements, we have to be very careful to make sure that accessibility functions are built in. Because in a native button element, whenever you tab over with your keyboard and press the space bar, it'll fire off that button, just like if you were to click it with a mouse. So the way to kind of get around this is to actually extend native HTML elements. So again, we extended the button element, so it included those accessibility functions, but it also included whatever functionality we wanted to set as well. So in talking about all the excitement and talking about how to get started, there are 3 things that you can really start doing, and that's experimenting, implementing, and sharing. Start experimenting with web components, build your own, or go on Polymer's website and start using their HTML elements. And then start trying to figure out how you can implement these web components in your next project. Start having those conversations at work about web components and seeing where it is that you could fit one in, even if it's extending a native HTML element. And then start sharing. One of the biggest things I've done over the past year is blogging about things that I find whenever I'm experimenting with web components or Polymer. And one of the biggest fears I had was that, well, there's tons of people that know way more about me, or know way more about this than I do, so why should I do anything? But really, for every one of those people that knows more about a subject than you, there's a lot more people that don't know about this subject, and the blog post that you write or the tweet that you send out may be what they read to get into this. So start sharing your custom elements. You can go to customelements.io and actually upload your own web components. So there's been a lot of developers that have started sharing everything that they've created, and so we don't have to start everything from scratch. So again, I hope that you're excited about web components. Hope you're excited about Polymer and just about the future of the web in general. And if you have any questions, I think we may have time to answer a couple right now. But then also, if you don't have time and you want to ask me later, I'll be here all week, and I'll be at the pool party as well. And if you want to geek out about performance, I'm always up for that as well. So thank you, guys.